Imagine being 6 or 7 years old, walking into a Roman temple, and being told that your childhood is basically over. You are not going to an ordinary school. You are not moving in with relatives. You are not choosing what you want to become when you grow up. You have been chosen for something that could control the next 30 years of your life. You will live under strict religious rules. You will not marry during your service. You will help protect one of the most sacred fires in Rome. And if Rome believed you had seriously violated your duties, the consequences could be terrifying. But here's the strange part. You are not exactly a prisoner. You could become one of the most respected women in the entire city. You could have unusual legal independence. You could own property. You could make a will. People could recognize you in public and treat you with extraordinary respect. So what exactly were you? A prisoner? A celebrity? A priestess? A symbol of Rome itself? The answer is complicated. This is what life could mean for a Vestal Virgin in ancient Rome. Let's call our fictional girl Livia. Livia is 7 years old. She lives with her parents in Rome. Her world is still small. She knows her home, her family, the streets around her, and the ordinary things that matter to a child. Then one day, adults begin discussing her future, and suddenly, everything changes. Livia has been selected to become a Vestal Virgin. Historically, Vestals were chosen when they were very young, generally around 6 to 10 years old, and the selection was subject to strict requirements. The process was connected to Rome's chief priest, the Pontifex Maximus. For a child, this wasn't simply receiving a new job. It meant entering an entirely different world. Livia would serve Vesta, the Roman goddess associated with the sacred hearth, and at the center of her new life was a fire, but not an ordinary fire. The sacred fire of Vesta was deeply connected with Rome's religious identity and the continuity of the Roman state. The Vestals were responsible for keeping it burning and performing important rituals connected with Vesta's worship. Imagine being 7 years old and being told that the flame in front of you isn't just a flame. It represents something much bigger. You have to protect it. You have to follow the rituals. You have to learn the rules. And you have to make sure nothing goes wrong, because ancient writers describe serious consequences when the sacred fire was allowed to go out. So Livia's new life begins with a responsibility most adults would find intimidating. But the fire is only the beginning. There is another rule that would shape almost her entire life. A Vestal was expected to remain sexually chaste during her period of service, and that service lasted 30 years. Traditionally, those 30 years were divided into 3 stages, about 10 years learning the duties, 10 years performing them, and another 10 years teaching the younger Vestals. Think about that. At 7, Livia begins. At 17, she is still serving. At 27, she is still serving. And only after completing the full period could she leave the priesthood and return to private life. While other Roman women were growing up, marrying, and building households, Livia's entire young adulthood would be tied to Vesta. But then comes the part that makes the Vestals so fascinating. They were not simply powerless girls trapped inside a temple. Quite the opposite. They had extraordinary privileges. A Vestal could have legal freedoms that many ordinary Roman women did not have. Ancient sources describe Vestals managing property and making wills. They could appear in public with an exceptional status, and ancient writers even describe circumstances in which a Vestal could intervene on behalf of a condemned person. Imagine Livia walking through Rome. People recognize her. They make room for her. She isn't just another young woman in the crowd. She is a Vestal. Her position gives her respect, visibility, and authority. From the outside, it almost sounds like an incredible deal. 30 years of service in exchange for status, protection, and privilege. But there was a catch. The privileges existed because Rome believed the Vestals were performing an incredibly important sacred duty. Their personal behavior wasn't treated as purely private. Their purity was connected to the religious well-being of Rome itself. And that is where the story becomes dark. If a Vestal was accused and convicted of breaking her vow of chastity, ancient Roman tradition describes an exceptionally severe punishment. Because she was a consecrated priestess, Roman religious rules created a horrifying problem. How do you punish a sacred woman without spilling her blood inside the city? According to ancient accounts, the answer was an underground chamber near the Porticalina. The condemned Vestal could be taken there and left with only minimal provisions. The man accused of violating her vow could face his own punishment. Now imagine Livia hearing about this as a child. She knows the rules. She knows what Rome expects from her. She knows that her behavior isn't considered only her own business. And suddenly, the beautiful temple, the white robes, the public respect, and the sacred fire look very different different, because the same institution that gives her extraordinary status also places enormous pressure on her. And there is another important detail. We shouldn't treat every ancient accusation as unquestionable fact. Our evidence comes largely from ancient writers, and ancient Roman religion was deeply connected with politics, reputation, and social power. Some individual cases were controversial. Some ancient writers themselves questioned what had really happened. So this wasn't a simple world where an accusation automatically meant guilt, but the existence of these punishments tells us something important. Rome took the role of the Vestals extremely seriously. A Vestal wasn't simply expected to obey. She was expected to represent something, Rome itself, and that creates the biggest contradiction in her entire life. She could have rights that many ordinary women did not. She could possess property. She could make a will. She could have extraordinary public status. She could become one of the most respected women in Rome. But she entered this life as a child. She didn't spend 20 years thinking about what she wanted to become. Adults made that decision. And for the next 30 years, Rome would tell her exactly what she was supposed to be. A priestess, a guardian, a symbol, a vestal. Then something strange happens. 30 years pass. Livia is no longer the little girl who entered the temple. She is an adult woman who has spent almost her entire remembered life serving Vesta. And now, she can leave. Ancient sources indicate that former Vestals could return to private life and could marry after completing their service, although not all apparently chose to do so. But imagine being Livia. You have spent 30 years inside a religious institution. You learned its rituals. You trained younger girls. You protected its sacred fire. You watched generations of Romans come and go. And then someone tells you, you're free. Free to do what? Get married, build a household, leave Rome, stay near the temple, live like an ordinary Roman woman. Technically, she had choices, but after 30 years, what would ordinary life even mean? That's the part we can't completely answer, because Livia is fictional. Her story is a way of understanding a real historical institution. The actual Vestals left behind something much more complicated than a simple story of victims and villains. They were powerful and restricted, respected and controlled, privileged and heavily burdened. Their lives were extraordinary, precisely because Rome believed their religious role was extraordinarily important. And maybe that is the most fascinating part. The Vestals weren't asked to protect an ordinary household fire. They were expected to help maintain a symbol of Rome's continuity. Their entire public identity was built around keeping something alive. And when everything went well, nobody needed to think about the danger. The fire simply burned. The rituals were completed. Rome continued. But if something went wrong, everyone noticed. So imagine Livia standing beside that sacred flame after decades of service. She is no longer a child. She has learned every ritual. She has trained younger Vestals. She has watched the city change around her. And the flame is still burning. She looks at it and realizes something. Rome gave her an extraordinary life. But Rome also decided what that life would be before she was old enough to understand the choice. And that's why the story of the Vestal Virgins is more complicated than saying Roman girls were forced to become priestesses. Some Vestals had status, wealth, legal independence, and genuine religious importance. Their position could be highly prestigious, but prestige doesn't erase sacrifice, and privilege doesn't automatically mean freedom. A child can be given a beautiful title and still have very little control over the life that comes with it. That's the uncomfortable lesson. The Vestal Virgins were powerful enough to be respected by Rome, but constrained enough to spend 30 years living according to rules created by Rome. And perhaps the strangest part is this: the Romans believed the sacred fire represented the life and continuity of their city, so they entrusted that sacred responsibility to girls who were barely old enough to understand what Rome itself meant. For 30 years, those women were expected to keep the flame alive. And while they protected Rome's sacred fire, Rome controlled the rules of their lives. That is what it really meant to be a Vestal Virgin. Not simply a priestess, not simply a privileged woman, and certainly not simply a victim. You were a symbol of Rome. You were given extraordinary power. You were given extraordinary responsibility. But from the moment you were chosen as a child, your future was no longer entirely yours.